America, and welcome to another Founding Friday, or Founders Friday. What do we call these things? Founders Fridays. Have you guys been watching them? We have a new studio audience here tonight. Have you guys been watching the Founding Fridays? Yes. Okay. Have you learned a lot? Yes. How many of you had heard of George Whitefield before, what was it, last week or the week before? Three people, four. It kind of changes your outlook on things, doesn't it? Things are starting to make sense. The more you learn, I used to ask the question, how did we get here? Are you beginning to understand how we got here? And where we need to go again? So let me ask you this, because tonight we want to do revisionist history. We want to correct some of the things that are happening, not just with the founders, but all across the board, and show you some of the examples of where history is just wrong. You know, one of the things I learned when I first started doing television, it was so spooky. I was over at CNN, and spooky for many reasons. But I was over there, and it was one of my first days. I said, hey, do we have that story on such and such? And they said, yes, Glenn, it'll be just a second. It's being ingested into the system. I'm like, okay, that's spooky. Ingested in the system. And I think, do we use the same language here? Is it, you know, yeah. It's a giant system, and what it means is when the story is done, it's put into the system, and then it can be called up anywhere in the world inside of the Fox system. But what it made me think of is, what happens if the first person or the second person that's ingesting the story gets it wrong? Because every time you write a story, you bring up all those other stories and you check it against to make sure the facts. If somebody's gotten it wrong, every other story after it is wrong. That's the problem. That's kind of what's happening with our history. Ask yourself these questions. Now you may, because you've been watching, you may know the answers to some of these. But a year ago, would you say that Washington was just a die-hard Christian? Would you say that? Yes, or who would say yes? A year ago? Okay, so there are four people. Woodrow Wilson. I didn't know anything about Woodrow Wilson. I mean, a year ago, would you say, I don't know, I guess he was an okay president? Okay? If you didn't know if you didn't watch the show, or he was a horror show, wasn't he? A horror show, possibly the spookiest president we've ever had. The New Deal. How many of us grew up in households that said, the New Deal saved America? Okay? All did. Now that you're learning something about the New Deal, did the New Deal save America? What was the Great Depression called in the rest of the world? Thank you. Right here. Just the Depression. Just the Depression. It wasn't great. They didn't try to social engineer their way out of it. FDR. This one I've always... once this light went on in my head, I thought, wait a minute. FDR. Did the American people love FDR? Did they? Let me ask you this. If you have a president that everybody loved, why would you, the minute the guy's body is cold, rush to the Capitol to write a law that says, oh, by the way, we got to stop term limits, we got to put term limits in right now? Why would you do that if he was so great? It doesn't make any sense, does it? A good portion of the country, they had to amend the Constitution. That's a big deal. A good portion of the country was terrified. They knew what kind of power this guy had amassed. Yet we don't read about that. But nobody even asked that question. CPI. Has anybody ever heard of the CPI?
Chicken in every pot or something?
Chicken in every pot? No. That would be CIP. CIEP. It was actually under Woodrow Wilson. If you spoke out against the government, okay, or any of the policies, you could go to jail for 20 years. We had 30,000 people put in jail during World War I for speaking out. If you read Cass Sunstein's words, it's these policies. Woodrow Wilson had spies. Woodrow Wilson had what he called 4-minute men, where they would step up in the public square and they would give 4-minute propaganda speeches. And they were selected in each city by, are you a mover or shaker? Are you somebody people will listen to? It was propaganda. How many people think the Nazis were the best at propaganda? How many people learned that, right?
Yeah.
Okay, Goebbels, right? They were great at it. Do you know if you read the diaries of Goebbels, do you know, I remember I had one of my staff members, I said, look up propaganda, read this stuff. He was reading the diaries of Goebbels. He came into my office and all the blood was drained out of his face. He said, can I read a passage? Do you know where Goebbels said they learned propaganda? Woodrow Wilson's administration. They learned it from us. They say that's why they lost World War I, and they knew if you don't get into propaganda and you're at least as good as the progressives in America, you're going to lose. And how about this one? If I told you that $2 trillion went missing, and Donald Rumsfeld stepped to the podium and said, by the way, we can't find $2 trillion. We're missing that $2 trillion. Would you believe that story? Ever heard of it? Watch the monitor. Watch the monitor.
According to some estimates, we cannot track $2.3 trillion in transactions.
According to some estimates, we can't find $2.3 trillion. Did anybody notice the date on that? Day before 9/11. So, the point is, history's got it wrong. You don't know about history. A lot of the stuff is revisionist intentionally. A lot of that stuff is happening because progressives need you to believe FDR was loved and the New Deal saved America. When the truth is, the thing that they have deleted from history, can anybody tell me about the Depression of 1920? Nobody. The Depression of you can, Stephen? A little bit? Tell me what you know.
I remember you dropped down to 50% of what it was, and it was turned around in basically 2 years by cutting government in half.
Okay. Woodrow Wilson, progressives, gigantic government. We went into a depression as bad as 1930. Okay? That's staggering. Harding and Coolidge get in with Mellon, and they say, we're going to cut taxes, I think, from 75% to 24%. And we're going to cut our budgets, our spending, in half. The Roaring Twenties. The Roaring Twenties. History has been deleted and selectively put in. All you know is, oh, the Roaring Twenties were greedy. No, no, no. That's a problem with the people, not the system. That's a problem with the people. Why do they just focus on the Roaring Twenties and not tell you what got the Roaring Twenties? Because it doesn't help their narrative of giant government. So you have revisionist history, doing it intentionally. Sometimes you just get it wrong because it's like it's ingested and it goes into the system, and then somebody else reads history years later and they're like, oh yeah, well, that guy, he's trustworthy, and he got it wrong. Other times, things just happen. We're missing $2.3 trillion. You can't account for it. September 11th happens and our priorities change. We've never gone back to that story. How many things do you think are true that aren't? And what does it mean for the course of our country? Tonight, we're going to try to get into some of that, and we have a couple of experts. We have Peter Lilback. He's the author of George Washington's Sacred Fire. It's a fantastic, fantastic book, Peter. How are you?
Thank you.
Have a seat. We also have with us Jerry Falwell, Jr. He's the Chancellor of Liberty University. And via satellite is Burton Folsom, Jr. He is the professor of history at Hillsdale College and the author of the book New Deal, Raw Deal. How are you, Burton?
Hey, I'm doing fine, Glenn. Thank you.
Tell me the thing that you found out about FDR and the New Deal. I mean, did you know when you started doing your research on how skewed history was?